AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, the Matt McNeil Show for your Thursday, 952-946-6205. Joining us right now is Matt Robeson. He is a podcast host, former congressional staffer, and he's written an exceptional opinion piece for Newsweek. No, these indictments don't strengthen Trump. That's just media nonsense. He's kind enough today to join us to talk about this editorial opinion piece. There was this narrative being pushed, I think, primarily by the right and as well by, I think, just the media that, oh, this is the biggest mistake. Trump's going to be unbeatable. And I thought it was laughable. You clearly as well agree with that.
Okay, let's all be clear about this. If you're thinking that anything negative just strengthens Donald Trump, folks, that's the sword of Gryffindor. That's not Donald Trump, okay? I want to say this as clearly as I can. There is absolutely no evidence, if you look at the polling, that all of these indictments have helped Donald Trump. That's the entire point of my piece in Newsweek, and I am happy to run through the numbers. It's what Barack would have called the audacity of math. But when Donald Trump said just this past week, the indictments came in, it's like, oh, this is going to help me. Every time I get indicted, I go up massively in the polls, or some horse pucky like that. Not true. Not true. He's gone up an average of like 1.5 points after his last two set of indictments. And after this last set came in, he went up 0.3 points. It's not true. It is total media nonsense.
And those numbers can be accounted for not by the masses, just Republicans who probably are just furious that he's being held accountable, that might not have been forever Trumpers. They just, okay, fine, I'm tired of the Democrats going after him. So those numbers are completely and totally understandable within the context.
They absolutely are. Look, I assume that all of your listeners are extremely intelligent and good looking too.
Yes.
So I'm going to go ahead and flatter them by using just a little bit of jargon for a second. There's something in polling known as differential non-response bias. Basically, all it means is if you're a super Trump fan and news like this comes in, then yeah, there's going to be a little bit of rally effect where you're like, they're coming after my guy. And what it means is that you might be more likely to pick up the phone. If a pollster calls, you're more likely to actually answer the poll. And you see this effect happen after major news events on all kinds of issues for people who feel strongly about that issue. And it is very consistent with the effect that we've seen with all of these Trump indictments, a small bump that lasts for a couple of weeks and then fades away. It's what we saw after the Mar-a-Lago raid. It's what we saw after the first impeachment. It's what we've seen after each of the first two tranches of indictments. It's what we're seeing right now. It's nothing to write home about.
Well, and it's similar to, it's narrative driving. And they basically want to seem like everything, we're always going to be the winner, we're always on top, we're always there. It's the reality is that it's damage control. It's good old fashioned damage control. I think some of the supporters are saying, okay, fine, I'll just go back to Trump. I don't necessarily feel as if it's going to resonate and create this massive wave back to Donald Trump come 2024 in any capacity. I think most people are furious with people that try to overthrow the government of the United States.
That's exactly the right way to think about it. Just to pose a thought experiment to all of your listeners, are there any Democrats, any independents out there, any Republicans who have moved on from Trump, and there are some, who are actually going to get this new evidence, these new indictments, look at that and say, oh, now I'm rallying back to Donald Trump. Boy, this really turned me around. No, there's also a lot of motivated reasoning involved here, especially on the part of the Trump team. In the Republican primary, they are all afraid to just stand up and say the emperor has no clothes, or more accurately, the emperor is a raving lunatic who should never be trusted with the nuclear codes. And of course, that's why they're all backing down against him. They're all afraid to criticize him. They all come out with these mealy-mouthed statements after these indictments like, well, I guess you can't possibly go after him because it'll hurt you in the Republican primary. It serves Trump's purposes, and it helps keep all of his rivals in check.
There are what seems to be a larger, growing number of Republicans who are of the mindset if we're going down this path again, no, I don't want any part of this party. And they're just, like I said, I think when you touch on this, there's just a common sense thing that just is people trying to scream into the wind because they know that Donald Trump is truly rotten. And I'm seeing even Republicans who are very clearly in larger and larger numbers running away from Trump at this point.
You're right. For one thing, there's polling data that suggests that fewer and fewer Republicans believe that he, quote, did nothing wrong. And more of them express openness to pollsters about supporting someone else. The other interesting effect that, if you look at the data, it's right there for anyone to look up, is Trump has touted how much of a fundraising boost he's gotten after these indictments. It is true, after the first set of indictments in New York, he did get a massive fundraising spike. You can find it. You can look up the data on WinRed. But what's interesting is that his fundraising bump after the second and the third set of indictments was much, much less. It seems to be wearing off. The other interesting thing is that when his rivals for the Republican nomination have spoken out against him, when they've gone after him, they have seen fundraising bumps. It seems like there is a portion of the Republican electorate that is thirsty for this. And I think if they could find the last remaining strands of connective tissue in their spines and go down this road, I think there is growing evidence that they would find that a much more productive approach, and they might give themselves a much better shot of slaying the demon and winning the nomination.
There is also this problem for Republicans. The mentality they want to be able to say is, sure, Donald Trump did something, but everyone does something, so it's equal. They're going after Hunter Biden right now. Everything they keep saying is happening is not happening. They've had testifying after testifying that he did nothing. Meanwhile, Jared Kushner, who worked in the White House, got $2 billion from the Saudis, which was literally, let's just call it what it was, a family payout to the Trump family to allow the Saudis to be able to murder whoever they wanted to. And the reality is these Republicans don't want to look at this. And there is this unbelievable lack of accountability on their one side while they're trying to make hay on the other side.
Look, if the world were fair, and if we had a media that was actually accountable and trying to report and be objective, then everything you just said would have been made true by the media long ago. And this whole gambit of trying to both sides everything, well, everyone does this, would have been exposed a long time ago. Perfect example, James Comer, the Republican congressman who is like the Inspector Javert going after Hunter Biden. Here's a question for you. Where's the bribe, James Comer? That was the headline in the Washington Post this morning. They have been going after Hunter Biden for a solid year now, holding hearings. They cannot find anything. Their sweaty desperation is beginning to reek. They have headlines on Fox News now where they're suggesting that because Hunter Biden made phone calls to the president and they talked about the weather, that there were secret weather-related codes being passed between the president and his son. And they really meant business, and storm clouds meant, I don't know, sales. And that's all to cover the fact that their hero, their dear leader, had to draw with a Sharpie on a hurricane to make true the BS lie he had just told. Look, the entire Republican strategy is an example of what South Park and social psychologists call a DARVO: deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. And we should really focus on that last part. Their entire strategy is about reversing the victim and the offender. Because they have such deep offenses on their side, their only way to survive is to try and say what you just said. Everyone does this, and the very offenses that they have committed, oh no, see, it's actually happening over there. It's happening over there. And it's all a smokescreen.
Well, and it's they're going after drag queens and saying, look, they're endangering kids, while they're trying desperately to cover up the insane amount of Republicans and Republican-leaning people who have been endangering kids. And so that's their
Jim Jordan, anyone?
Yeah, exactly. Well,
Denny Hastert, anyone? He's actually in federal prison, the former Speaker of the House. And I don't want to talk about his offenses. This is a family show.
Anton Lazaro, we just had he was sentenced to 21 years yesterday in Minnesota here with a guy who was close with the Republican Party in Minnesota. The one thing, though, is this, and about these kind of stories, they would not have traction if not for a news media that likes to basically doom scroll liberals. They're basically, oh, you're about to lose again. Oh, no, this is going to go bad. There is this undeniable gloom and doom narrative from the media. And that when I look at this, I'm glad you're calling this out, because the reality is, stop just taking their talking points and running and writing a news story off them, because the reality is, even a very logical analysis of this argument would show it's ludicrous to think that a person getting indicted for crimes is going to help them out in the long run.
I've had the former Chicago Tribune editor Mark Jacob on my show Beyond Politics, which, by the way, shameless plug, I urge everyone to subscribe to when you're not listening to Matt McNeil on the radio, which you should be doing all the time. And he points, this is something that he actually feel some ownership responsibility. He's actually apologized for on Twitter that he's been part of the mainstream media that has begun to adopt this stance of essentially being willing stenographers and therefore enablers for lying and the creeping autocracy that we're seeing from the Republican Party. The Republican Party long ago left behind the idea that they could win on a fair democratic playing field. And so you've seen them try to juke the vote, suppress the vote. And when they can't win via the vote, like we just saw in Ohio, they try and change the rules, move the goalposts. And if they still can't win under those circumstances, what you see is January 6th. And the mainstream media sees their role as essentially, I need to be invited to the right cocktail parties. I need to maintain my access to both political parties. So I'm going to take the quote from this side and I'm going to take the quote from that side. I'm going to report them equally as two equal points of view. My daughter at the dinner table last night was talking about a YouTube video in which flat earthers appeared alongside actual scientists debating the question of whether the earth was flat. I pointed out the logical fallacy here. I'm sure you see it, and I'm sure all of your listeners
Yeah.
see it as well. Lies and scientific truth on an equal playing field, and you're suggesting that they should meet in the middle and come to a compromise. That is not the way this is supposed to work. And the news media's function is not to be stenographers. It is to reveal truth, present objective facts, and they're not doing it, which means they're not doing their job, and they're part of what's dragging down American democracy.
Part of this, of course, is that narrative, as you just described perfectly there. But part of it is too, there are too many Democrats, particularly moderate Democrats, that basically buy hook, line, and sinker Republican talking points. I'm going to give out Dean Phillips. He's Minnesota 3. He's the guy that's now thinking, kind of floating the idea he might challenge and primary Joe Biden. Now, first of all, I don't care if someone primaries him. That's the system. If someone wants to, you're more than welcome to. I think Joe Biden's done enough to warrant getting reelected personally. What I'm not hearing is not a guy who's looking at the reality of all the stuff that Joe Biden has done, but is seeming to basically get his narrative from Republican talking points. And I think that there has to be this mentality of the Republicans are lying and you need to ignore them because they're not telling you the truth.
Look, I was a congressional staffer for about 10 years and a campaign operative, ran a bunch of congressional campaigns. I worked for centrist, moderate Democrats. And I think that there was a different political reality where it still made sense to accept on a good faith basis that there were different points of view on issues like economics, trade, even cultural matters. But now, as we've kind of covered here, there's such a vested interest from the Republican Party and their co-enablers, co-conspirators, unindicted co-conspirators at Fox News to distort and lie about the truth. Take, for example, President Biden's record. This is a man who's presided over record job growth when Donald Trump oversaw the loss of 6.3 million jobs, the biggest growth in manufacturing jobs in 30 years, the lowest unemployment rate in the last 50 years. And you go down the numbers, the achievements of Joe Biden and this economy, and there's just no case. And yet you find Republicans out there saying Americans are really struggling in the Joe Biden economy. And it's a complete fabrication and distortion. And to accept it and run on it and assume that there's some middle ground, it's like the flat earthers versus the scientists. Some things there isn't a middle ground compromise about.
And I don't think Dean Phillips is saying that verbatim, but he does seem to be echoing a lot of Republican talking points. And I just think to yourself, as you just laid out, you take a look at the record here. Joe Biden deserves another nod here. And we got to stop the doom scrolling and just do not buy Republican talking points as facts. Matt Robeson, once again, the podcast is Beyond Politics. And of course, and everyone knows Blue Amp from Cliff Schecter. I really appreciate the time today.
Absolutely a pleasure. Great to be part of the Axis of Matt.
Thank you. Nice to be loved. I will take a break. Come on back. It's the Matt McNeil Show right here on AM 950.